In this video, we're going to be taking a look at bioethics and moral theories. Specifically, we're going to look at a number of moral theories which many bioethicists used in order to support different views and different claims. We'll then take a quick look at how to evaluate moral theories and moral views. All right, so we're going to start with moral theories, then we're going to look at criteria for judging moral theories and moral views to see if they're good or not. And then we'll briefly evaluate some of the prominent moral theories against these criteria. So the first thing to understand is what moral theories are trying to do. So moral theories try to explain a number of things. A big thing that moral theories are trying to explain is what is it that ultimately makes an action right or wrong. So if you make a promise to your friend and you break the promise because you're negligent, you did something wrong. But what exactly makes that action wrong? Is it because you harmed your friend in some kind of way? Is it because you disrespected your friend or you did something unfair? Or maybe it's just because you went against a moral rule. So there are many things that are morally wrong, but moral theory tries to figure out what makes these things morally wrong. It also looks at the nature of what makes something permissible versus morally wrong versus morally obligatory. Moral theories also take a look at what makes people good or bad people. So it investigates the nature of virtue and character. So what makes somebody have a good character. It also looks at value and trying to explain what's intrinsically valuable versus instrumentally valuable. So something is intrinsically valuable when it's valuable in and of itself. So it would be valuable even if it did not get us something else that's valuable. So most philosophers think that, for example, happiness is intrinsically valuable. And there may be other things that are intrinsically valuable as well. Moral theories investigate other things like moral responsibility or moral blame. What are the conditions when somebody should be held responsible or accountable? It also looks at the nature of moral status and moral worth. So what is it that gives something moral status? So something has moral status if it can be wronged. So this pen right here has no moral status. I can break it in half and I'm not wronging the pen. But a person has moral status. If I hurt somebody, I am wronging them. So there are some things that are capable of being wronged. Other animals also have a moral status. It's possible to wrong other animals. So in virtue of what does something have a moral status? Is it because it can feel pain? Is it because it has interests? So there are many different answers to that question. What we're going to focus on today is this first issue up here, theories that try to explain what makes an action right or wrong, at least fundamentally. Now, regarding moral theory and trying to figure out whether or not something is right or permissible, there are two broad approaches that you see within applied ethics and bioethics. The first sort of general approach that you can take is consequentialist, or under the umbrella of consequentialism. Now, there are many different kinds of consequentialist theories, but what they all have in common is that they all say that rightness depends solely on the consequences. So if you're trying to figure out if an action is right or wrong, or a policy is a good or bad policy, you only look at the consequences of that policy. And this is something that we do all the time. We try to investigate the possible consequences of our actions in order to figure out if those actions are good or bad, or right or wrong. Another broad approach is a deontological approach, which basically means rule-based or duty-based. So here the rightness of an action depends on whether or not it's in line with our duties, and it doesn't depend just on the consequences. So for the deontological approach, it's a principled base. So you're not so much looking at the consequences of the action ultimately, but rather you're looking at whether or not the action aligns with certain principles. And in the other video, we took a look at some of these principles in bioethics that are used, like the principle of beneficence, the principle of autonomy, and so on. So that is more of a deontological approach. Now, in bioethics, you can use a combination of approaches in order to support and evaluate certain views. So one approach doesn't necessarily rule out another. I think in applied ethics, you can use a plurality of approaches. Okay, so let's take a look at the first kind of consequentialism called utilitarianism. So you may have heard of utilitarianism before. Some of its founders were John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, two English philosophers. And this is a consequentialist theory. So it looks at the consequences of an action in order to determine if that action is right. Now, there are different kinds of utilitarianisms. We're just going to look at a kind called act utilitarianism very briefly. So according to act utilitarianism, an action is right if and only if and because it promotes the highest overall net balance of well-being to harm when compared to other alternatives. So basically, in a nutshell, act utilitarianism says the right thing is the thing that produces the most well-being and the least amount of happiness. So if you're trying to figure out what to do, you look at all your options and you choose that option that promotes the most overall well-being and least amount of harm. Now, here the key word here is overall well-being. So it's not just about your own well-being, it's about overall well-being and on the planet, in the universe. So a utilitarian theory requires an account of what well-being is. And there are different theories of well-being, but many utilitarians say that happiness is well-being. So if you want to do the right thing, then you're just trying to promote overall happiness and minimize misery. Now, another kind of ethics is Kantian ethics. And Kantian ethics is a deontological approach, so it falls under that second general approach to ethics. And there are different kinds of Kantian approaches that we see today in ethics, but we'll just look at Kant's own principles. So this goes back to Immanuel Kant, German philosopher. And basically, according to this Kantian approach to ethics, morally right actions are fair, and they respond appropriately to the fact that we all share equal dignity. So morality, according to Kant, is oriented around two things: fairness and respect. So that's what morality is all about according to Kant. So Kant rejects consequentialism, rejects utilitarianism. He says if you want to know what's right or wrong, you don't it's not ultimately the consequences that make it right or wrong. Rather, it's whether or not the action is fair and whether or not the action is respectful. And he gives two principles to articulate how to act fairly and how to act respectfully. The principle of universalizability shows us how to act in a fair way. And that says act according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So this is kind of a mouthful, but basically what it's saying is this. A maxim is a rule that we give ourselves, and it tells us how we're going to act and why we're going to do that thing. So we give ourselves sort of rules of action all the time. You might say, I'm going to get up every day at 7 o'clock in order to get more done throughout the day. So that's basically a maxim. So the principle of universalizability says that if the action that your maxim or rule recommends can become a universal rule that everybody agrees on, if you could rationally choose that it become a universal rule, then that action is right or permissible. To put it in a more common sense way, the principle of universalizability basically says don't make an exception of yourself. And that's the fair way to act. All right, so let's go to the principle of humanity. The principle of humanity basically tells us how to act in a respectful way. And it says act in such a way that you treat all people, including yourself, as an end and not merely as a means. So what that says is you shouldn't just use people. You should treat people with respect. Now, we use people in a way all the time. Students use teachers in order to gain knowledge. We use a mechanic in order to fix our car, and so on. So there's nothing wrong with using people, but what's wrong is merely using them as if they were some kind of object. So what would be wrong, according to Kant, an example of using somebody in this bad way would be pretending to be friends with somebody just so you could use their car and get rides. So that would be against the principle of humanity, according to Kant. Okay, so just to sum up Kant, generally the Kantian approach stresses respect for others and fairness. So that's That's the main thing here. Now we're going to go over real quick a few other moral theories. There's also natural law theory, which states that right actions are those actions that conform to certain moral standards. And these moral standards are part of the fabric of nature, and we can know them through reason. So natural law theorists think that moral codes can sort of be derived from nature. So morally right actions are those that are in accordance with our natural ends. So our ends are our purpose. So nature has endowed us with a purpose, and right actions are those that conform or contribute to that purpose. Now it's a big question, well, what is that purpose and how do we figure it out? But we'll just leave it at that for natural law theory. Now another theory, which actually has its roots in Kant, is contractualism. And contractualism is another way of saying that morality is oriented around mutual respect for others. According to this view, the correct or legitimate principles of justice or morality are those that people would agree under some sort of hypothetical condition. So the basic idea here is that an action is right if it's recommended by a rule that we can all agree to, is assuming that we're all being reasonable and the agreement is fair. That way you're not sort of telling somebody what to do without their consent. So you can kind of see how this approach is rooted in respecting others. If we're going to create a rule that everybody has to follow, then respect requires us to get everybody's consent to follow that rule. That's what's going on with contractualism. So earlier we talked about two broad approaches, the consequentialist approach, the deontological approach. Utilitarianism falls under the consequentialist approach. Kantian ethics and contractualism fall under the deontological approach. But what all those approaches have in common is that they're focused on the rightness or wrongness of actions. So they're focused on actions, what we should do. Now, if we want to take a sort of a fundamentally different approach from all that, we get virtue ethics. So virtue ethics focuses not so much on the rightness and wrongness of action, but rather the goodness or badness of character. So virtue ethics focuses on the development of a virtuous character and how we can evaluate how good a person is. And it does this by investigating the nature of virtue, which includes how do we develop virtue. So when it comes to actions, virtue ethics will say that acting in accordance with the right motives is crucial to being virtuous. So virtue ethics is more about how ought I be rather than what ought I do. Now we also have ethics of care. Ethics of care it came out of a feminist approach to ethics, which we'll see in a little bit. But ethics of care has some similarities with virtue ethics. According to this kind of ethics, the field of ethics needs to shift its focus to the unique demands of specific situations and to the virtues and feelings that are central to personal relationships like empathy, compassion, love, sympathy, and fidelity. So ethics of care says what we need to focus on in ethics aren't the consequences or maximizing good consequences or duties or anything like that. Rather, the ethics of care needs to be oriented around care, hence the name ethics of care, specifically the kind of care that you see in close relationships. So ethics of care is very relationship based, and it sort of takes as its model the relationship between parent and child. And so care should inform our ethical decision making. And often that involves looking at the particulars of each kind of situation. Now we also have feminist ethics, and again, ethics of care is a kind of feminist ethics, and generally feminist ethics is an approach that focuses on unveiling or revealing oppressive and often subtle power relations, and specifically certain kinds of power relations that oppress women. And the basic idea here is that these power relations that are oppressive to women are sometimes they can be so normalized that they don't even seem oppressive, that they just seem normal, like the natural order of things. And so feminist ethics tries to sort of reveal oppression where we may not see it initially. Right? Another approach isn't really based in principles, isn't really based in theory. It's called casuistry. So rather than evaluating moral cases by appealing to principles or theories, casuistry is a method that emphasizes reasoning from analogous cases where our considered judgments are more secure. So let me explain. First of all, a considered judgment is just a common basic intuition about the wrongness and rightness of things. So this is an intuition that we have when we're thinking clearly and rationally. So if I say, Bobbert tortures puppies in his basement, is that right or wrong? Our considered judgment says that is wrong. That's pretty basic. That's going to be wrong. So it's a judgment about morality of an action that we would make under careful consideration. And a lot of it just kind of boils down to our basic intuitions about these things. So casuistry tries to say this. We look at a difficult case. I'll give you an example. Are we morally obligated to give to charities that save the lives of children? Like Oxfam, for example. Are we morally obligated to do that? A lot of people say it's good to do, but we're not morally obligated to. We wouldn't be blameworthy if we didn't. Well, one way to answer the question if we're morally obligated to give to charity is to look at an analogous case. In other words, a case that is morally equivalent. So Peter Singer gives a different case that appeals to our considered judgments. So in this case, you're walking by a shallow pond and a child is drowning. Now you're wearing really expensive shoes that cost like $200, and you know if you save the child's life, it will ruin those shoes. Are you obligated to save the child's life? If we use our considered judgments, our basic intuitions say, of course you are obligated to save that child's life, even if it's going to ruin your pair of shoes. Now, if the case of giving to charities that save a child's life is morally analogous, morally the same, then we should also give to charities in the same way that we should save the child's life, because giving to a charity like Oxfam will contribute to saving a life. So that's just an example of reasoning in this kind of way, reasoning by analogy, engaging in casuistry. Okay, so how do we go about evaluating how good a moral theory is, or evaluating how good a moral view or a moral argument is? Well, we're going to take a look at some criteria that we can use to judge how good some kind of view or theory is. So the first criteria is that the view or theory needs to be consistent with our considered judgments. Basically what this means is that it needs to be consistent with common moral sense. So if you have a theory or a view that ultimately that could permit an action that's intuitively bad or wrong, then that's a strike against a theory. So if you have a theory that permits harvesting people's organs against their will, then there's something wrong with the theory, and you're going to have to go back and change the theory, because it's obviously wrong to harvest people's organs against their will. And that we'll see that example come up in a second. So the second criteria is that it needs to be consistent with the facts of moral life. So here are some sort of facts of moral life. The character of moral reasons are pretty strong. So moral reasons tend to override other kinds of reasons, like prudential reasons. We can be mistaken about our moral beliefs. It's possible to get things wrong. There are some theories that are inconsistent with that fact, and that's a problem for those theories. Supererogatory actions are possible. Supererogatory actions are actions that go above and beyond the call of duty. So they're actions that are good and praiseworthy, but are not morally obligatory. If a moral theory cannot explain how supererogatory actions are possible, then that's inconsistent. It's being inconsistent with facts of moral life. The third criteria is that it needs to be somewhat useful. We should be able to actually use it in order to solve moral problems. It needs to be applicable. All right, so real quick, let's go through and apply these adequacy criteria that we just talked about to the two theories that we took a look at earlier. So remember, utilitarianism says that All we need to look at are the consequences of the action. And an action is morally right if it produces the best overall good to bad consequences, specifically maximizes overall well-being. Is that consistent with our considered judgments? Or is that consistent with common moral sense? Well, one way to figure that out is to think of a situation that's obviously bad that utilitarianism morally permits. So here's an example. Let's say that you have 5 patients. 4 of them are going to die unless they get an organ transplant, and they each need different organs. Now, another person is perfectly healthy, and a surgeon can harvest the single person's organs and be able to save the other 4 people's lives. Now, let's not worry about the law. Let's say this person can get away with it. We're just worried about the morality of this. Utilitarianism would say, all other things being equal, you should harvest this person's organs to save the 4 lives, even if it's against that person's will, because the outcome will be much better than if you didn't do that, if you didn't harvest this person's organs. So utilitarianism seems to require, in many cases, to sacrifice the one to save the many, even if it's against that person's life. And that really seems morally problematic. So there are cases in which it looks like utilitarianism goes against our considered judgments. Is it consistent with the moral facts of life? Let's skip that one. The big one is number 1, and that I think poses a strong worry, a strong problem for utilitarianism. Resourcefulness for problem solving. Utilitarianism seems to fare pretty well. In order to apply it, you basically engage in a cost-benefit analysis. You find all your options, and for each option you weigh up the costs and benefits that will result, where the cost is misery and the benefit is happiness. Okay, let's take a look at Kantianism. All right, so are Kant's principles consistent with our moral judgments? One thing Kant says is that many duties are absolute. You can never break them. He actually thought this about promise keeping, that you're never permitted to break a promise, or you're never permitted to lie. He thought that you should never lie. And that's absolute. But that does seem to go against our considered judgments. We can think of cases in which surely it's okay to lie. There's not many, but there are some cases in which if lying prevents someone from being killed or something like that, then that seems okay in that case to lie. Is Kant's principles consistent with moral facts of life? Well, Kant believed that the reason we should do the right thing is out of duty. You should do it simply because it's your duty. This often seems appropriate, but there are other cases in which this doesn't seem correct. This motivation, this reason for doing things seems inconsistent with the right kinds of reasons for doing the right thing. Let's say your mom is in the hospital. The right thing to do is to go visit her in the hospital. But it seems like doing it merely out of a sense of duty is not appropriate. That seems to be the wrong kind of reason to go visit your mom in the hospital, whereas the right kind of reason is simply because you care about her. And this seems to get into more of the ethics of care. The ethics of care here seems to get right the right kind of motivation, the right kind of reason, whereas Kantianism doesn't seem to get that right. So you can take these criteria and apply it to all kinds of moral theories, and you're going to find problems with all the moral theories. That doesn't mean that they're all wrong. It just means that maybe certain ones need to be amended a little bit or whatever in order to improve upon them. But that's how we test moral theories. Similar to how we can test theories of physics by running experiments, we test moral theories using these criteria.